my background is I was trained as a linguist. I had learned to speak about 7 languages because I picked up languages easily. I also studied at MIT with Noam Chomsky, and I have taught at the University of Berkeley only as a visiting lecturer in an interdisciplinary program. But really, my work going back now since 1975 is based on, having had this very unusual experience of arriving in a place called Ladakh, or Little Tibet, in 1975. I was asked to go out as part of a film team because I picked up languages easily, and they wanted me to help with the filming by learning a little bit of the language of this ancient Tibetan culture high on the Tibetan plateau. There's a part of Tibet that belongs to India. And I had lived and studied in many different countries, and I was very interested in understanding different worldviews. But here I had the very rare opportunity to live in and speak the language fluently of an ancient pre-industrial culture. And that over rather quickly changed my thinking. And I'm coming from a very, very sort of global, distant view, looking at how cultures around the world have been transformed by a globalizing economy. And very quickly, so I have, basically what I've seen is that the economic system, that is the global economic system, is shaping identity, is shaping our relationships to one another, is shaping our relationships to nature. And it's been shaping those relationships in an extremely destructive way from the beginning. But we have not been allowed to have insight into what life was like before global traders and elites pushed people into cities, like with the enclosures in England, and at the same time slavery in other parts of the world. What was set up was a system that favored global traders. And those global traders were then part of thinking that brought in the modern economy with the basic principle being comparative advantage. And that principle said, it's not in your interest, in your region, or even in your country, to provide for your own needs. You do not need to have diversified production to feed yourselves, provide clothing, shelter. That is not necessary. You should focus on what you're best at. You should specialize for export. So, of course, with the slaves, that meant, they were pushed onto cotton fields or tea plantations or into mines. And in the case of Europe, with the enclosures, what was created was cheap labor. And then the baseline, our historical baseline, has been Dickensian London, where everything was a mess. People were pushed in, huge gap between rich and poor, filth, poverty, pollution, ill health. Now, I saw with my own eyes how in 1975, when the global economy came in through the nation state, it's not always clear that it's global because it comes in also with the help of the national government and national industries. But I witnessed in essentially over, already within 2 years, I ended up staying there. I fell in love with people who were the most vibrant, the most vital, the happiest, and the healthiest people I had ever encountered. Fell in love, gave up my job in Paris. I'd been living in Paris and stayed. And I witnessed firsthand this dramatic destruction. And one of the first, very clear signpost of that was when butter, which had been transported for 2 weeks over the Himalayas, came to Ladakh selling for half the price of butter from a farm a 5-minute walk away. Now, that was the sort of one point that had my eyes opened, so that later on, when I was invited to Mongolia or to meet with the Maasai in Kenya, or even going back to England and my native country of Sweden, I was watching this strange thing that food from the other side of the world tended to be cheaper than local food. And so I've been looking rather like you, Dave, at the sort of monopolistic control, but seeing that if we really understand that the driving mechanisms are global, and we understand that both left and right governments have gone along with pressures from global banks and corporations to continually deregulate and subsidize global monopolies at the expense of national industries even, and of course, small everything, shops, post offices, hospitals, schools, everything having to merge to survive. The whole process drives people away from the land. And this is why I also very early on became aware of the need to defend the rights of farmers, small farmers. Right now, a group called Via Campesina is beginning to finally have a bit of a voice in England. I and my organization, Local Futures, we have been trying to raise awareness about them for more than about 30 years. So they are small farmers, a global association representing about 200 million small farmers. They've been trying to get people to wake up to the fact that our governments are negotiating trade treaties. And what that means is that they are negotiating treaties that allow global corporations to enter national economies completely freely, to set up free ports, free trade zones. But above all, they've been lobbying governments to build up the global infrastructure. And unfortunately, the internet has suited this system perfectly. So in the financial casino, every day we now have algorithms searching for ways to extract profit for billionaires. Those billionaires are global. There are as many Chinese, Indian, Indonesian, and often now more from so-called poor countries. We have, ever since my eyes were open to the destruction of the local, I've been trying to raise awareness about the urgent need worldwide to strengthen local economies as a way of enabling genuinely local democracy, as a way of enabling the rebuilding of social cohesion, as a way of enabling us also to rely more on experiential knowledge, the direct relationship with one another, the direct relationship with the farms, with the water, the soil, the forest on which we depend. I would argue today that most of the crises we face, and that includes what's happening in Palestine and Israel right now, it includes the tragedy that climate emissions are rising hand in hand with the increase in poverty, where the majority of people are having to work longer and harder hours to just put food on the table and a roof over their head. So poverty is rising very rapidly. We can see in England now middle-class people who have to choose between heating and eating. It's been happening over the last 30 years. I've worked with economists in England and in the US who wrote books about how, as GDP was growing, the average person was getting poorer. But of course, those books did not get out into the mainstream media. They did not get visibility in mainstream academia, because what's been happening is that particularly since the 80s, the corporate trade treaties I mentioned have been more and more coercive, and they are literally suing governments if governments do anything to reduce the profit potential of global business. So in these trade treaties, which most people think are about trade between countries, they're not. They're about giving global traders more freedom. And those treaties now include clauses called ISDS, Investor-State Dispute Settlements. And in those clauses, governments sign in black and white, we will not do anything that could reduce your profit-making potential. So more recent, probably now 2 years ago, when Germany decided to phase out nuclear power after Fukushima, a Swedish nuclear power company sued Germany for several billion, and Germany had to pay. But this has been going on increasingly and in a more maddening way. I won't belabor it more, but I just hope that any of you who care about justice, who care about any kind of resilience or ecological sustainability, who care about human health, the health of ecosystems, please look at these treaties, look up ISDS, Investor-State Dispute Settlement. I realized already when my eyes were only open to the trade treaties in the mid-80s. From the mid-70s, I was aware how enormously destructive the global economy was. And I could see it expanding, not just into Ladakh, where I ended up working with local people to try to raise awareness so that they would have a stronger resistance, maintain more of their cultural self-respect, and choose development where it really made sense. We later on worked in Bhutan over a 5-year period. Well, in both Ladakh and Bhutan, I witnessed how groups that had lived side by side for hundreds of years, in the case of Ladakh, it was Muslims and Buddhists, side by side for 500 years. There had never been group conflict. I witnessed step by step how pushing people off the land into the city, fighting over artificially scarce jobs, dependent on centralized power, how that led to divisiveness. So this is what happened in most of the colonies. As the colonial powers came in, centralized the economy, urbanized it, and pitted groups against each other, instead of allowing for local interdependence. When we live closer to the land and the water, that is the real economy, we need one another. And we need multi-generational interaction. That is how we evolved. So if we go back to pre-industrial, we go back to the evidence of many indigenous cultures, we can see some basic principles. And of course, we can't now go back to living in exactly the way that indigenous cultures did, but there's the basic truth about the local interdependence, local knowledge, and opening our eyes as quickly as possible to the fact that the urban centers that have been created through this modern economy have made sure that per capita, everyone uses more resources than they need to if they're in smaller cities or villages. Today, one of the most important things is to support a process of localization linked to ruralization. We need to protect the farmers who are there. We need to allow small towns and cities to survive. And we need to start decreasing the scale of these giant cities. But at the moment, our governments are locked into a frightening blindness. And to me, the main problem we're facing is that the scale of the global economy is so large and it's so distant that almost no people who are fighting for ecological protection, to defend the rights of elephants, the rights of dolphins, the rights of human beings to survive, almost none of all of those billions of people trying to protect to protect both people and ecosystems, have looked at the global system. So what I've seen, and I've had people in my family from big business, I've had personal contact with CEOs, with ministers, prime ministers, and I've seen that the higher up the ladder you go, the more lost you are in essentially a numerical map of the world where you do not understand either psychology, social relationships, or nature. So you're going as a government official, as long as you go along with GDP, you are going along with left and right supporting increases in cancer, increases in pollution, increases in crime, and we're calling that progress. So we really are talking about rethinking the foundations of the economy. And when we do, we have this enormous opportunity to come together across divides that are now tearing us apart, between rich and poor, between left and right, between indigenous and non-indigenous, between handicapped and non-handicapped. We're talking about every category now is helping to divide us. We have a very, very strong unified message. And just now we had a big summit in Bristol, because we're working with the former mayor who started the Bristol Pound. He's attended some of our international conferences around the world and become more and more persuaded about localization. Because of working with us, he's also now become more interested in food and farming. The Bristol Pound, unfortunately, is not really working, Dave. And when Rob Hopkins came to Totnes, I had already started local food initiatives in Totnes, and I tried to persuade him to look at the global economy, but it's very hard to get people to do that. So he and many of my colleagues were persuaded about peak oil. I was saying, well, what I'm seeing in the financial casino, I'm not so sure that the price of oil is actually going to lead to these changes. So, and climate, you have to understand that the climate issue is being framed by big business. And literally, when Al Gore stood up on his ladder and talked about climate change, he mentioned nothing about the fact that he was supporting the free trade that meant that our industries were going to China, Indonesia, Mexico to produce what we needed in the industrial world to drive up emissions massively, just the transport alone, but also employing people in slave-like conditions, using lots of energy. Now, what's happened to industry, to global production, how that drives the supermarkets and the concentration, in the financial hubs, including London. But we have to really, I think the opportunity to really understand localization increases if we're willing to spend a little time understanding globalization better. And I'm glad that in the Transition Town Network, they've shifted more now to looking at the economic side of things. Rob was speaking at our conference where, the permaculture movement, there are lots of movements that should be linked with your movement, Simon, and also what you're doing, Dave. There is huge scope now, more than ever before. But all these years, I thought, well, I'm going to do my best. Once I learned about the trade treaties in 1985, I was thrilled, because before that, I was witnessing the impact of this disastrous economic direction on every country I visited. And I was invited to lots of countries because there was interest from around the world in what we were saying. And I was seeing, when I went back to Sweden, I hadn't quite realized the extent to which progress in Sweden meant very high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide. But the departure point in Ladakh and Bhutan opened my eyes to the fact that no wonder in Stockholm, already in the 70s, more than half the dwellings were inhabited by one person living alone in a high-rise building. So cheap fossil fuels had allowed these very progressive governments to drive people off the land, replace them with machinery, and of course, destroy the land. Industrial agriculture actually never produced more food per acre of land, never. It produced more food per unit of labor. And this is what we have to wake up to. We have a vast overabundance of labor. We have an overabundant renewable energy source, which is the human population. As long as our governments blindly on left and right and green and everybody keep pushing for this direction, we are replacing people with resources, energy, and mining the planet to death to go and fight over minerals on Mars and replace humans with robots. And there's a lot of propaganda about robots now. It's hard to share what I have to say without, I'm hoping people will look at our films. I think our film, The Economics of Happiness, is still a very good introduction to what we're saying. Also, our film, Ancient Futures, but above all, my book, Ancient Futures, hopefully can give an overall perspective. What we have found is that supporting localization around the world, and we have done so even in the UK. We helped to start one of the first new farmers markets. We started a local food program. We worked with the Soil Association. Still to this day, it's very difficult for people to understand the importance of local food. And I'm now realizing it's because they don't understand what's going on in the global economy. It's now a bit of an emergency. We need to support the idea of fresh, healthy, diversified food production in the region and do that as quickly as we can. By the way, if you're in Manchester, do you know about the big community garden in Manchester? It's a fabulous example of what can happen in a relatively short time. And so both in the city and around the city and virtually everywhere, we should be looking at the local food economy as the most strategic thing to start with. If we can get more genuinely localized economies, we will be able to use local currencies. But I can tell you, Dave, we promoted local currencies. We started to in America. We've worked, known about them around the world, and they're generally not working. And I'm so thrilled to say that in this very, very destructive environment, where governments are not only deregulating global businesses, but over-regulating locally. A lot of regulations that are brought in terms of diversity, in terms of handicapped people, in terms of cleanliness, and supposedly in the public interest, are punishing small businesses, while the giants that can often afford many of the changes win, because the regulatory framework is very costly for the small, for nonprofits and for small business. So we have to be very aware that our governments have deregulated and subsidized global business while over-regulated and taxed everything place-based. Once that picture becomes clear and we collaborate at the local level, we can start pressuring local councils. And there are some very, very inspiring examples that give you so much faith in humanity, convince you that human beings do not want to be pressured into this fear that leads to racism, that leads to fear of one another. We actually want to belong to a community. We want to help whenever possible. And we see that also in crisis. I guess I need to stop now and